So I'm Lynnette Allen, and I'm here with my friend, old friend, Joy Gilfilen, for sheriff. She's running for sheriff. Yay, Joy.
Yay.
And I wanted to just do a short interview with you, Joy, and I wanted to thank you for running for sheriff. I know you ran for office before.
Whatcom County Executive.
It'll be joy, joy, joy down in my heart if you're elected sheriff, Joy, because things will change. I'm calling you the transformational sheriff.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah. So we'll start out. What have you done so far? You've done so much for this community, Joy, and I've been around for 40 years watching it. So I would you just please kind of run off quickly, hopefully, what you've done, because you've done so much.
Well, you know, if I go back 40 years, the first place is that I got involved doing the Fairhaven 1990 task force, and I chaired a committee to develop a long-range plan for Fairhaven, because at that point, back in the 80s, it was under threat of becoming an industrialized port. And I was working with the Visitor and Convention Bureau before that, and I realized that tourism and historical civic communities, what are today called urban villages, would be a perfect solution for Fairhaven. And I got a group of people together. We created an urban village. Eventually started out, we wrote up a report called the Fairhaven 1990 Task Force Report, which created a vision for Fairhaven, which allowed the Alaska Ferry to choose to move here. It allowed the beautification of Fairhaven. It allowed a lot of block grants to be brought in, and Fairhaven changed. So that was one project.
Oh, I remember that, and I was so happy when that happened. And then I found out that you were the one that instigated that, and I was just going, it was awesome.
And I was single then, so if you look it up as the Fairhaven 1990 Task Force Report, it comes in as Phyllis Joy Schroeder at that point, and I was back then very single. And I had started, also I was working at SPIE, the International Society for Photo-Optical Instrumentation Engineers, and when I worked for them, I developed with Terry Montagna. I was the assistant to the technical director up there, and I spearheaded the first conferences ever held in the world on fibers and laser optics, which was the beginning, and it spawned the development of their biomedical optics program, which is now something like 25 to 30% of their business. And it was all spawned because I was unwilling actually to allow medical doctors and scientists to be working on instrumentation without talking to each other. That was just preposterous to me, and I insisted that it happen, and Terry gave me my head, and we got it done. Started in 1986.
Yay, Joy.
Thanks.
All right, so what else, Joy?
Then I got involved when I had the children. I had 2 boys, and back then I started working in the home-based business industry because they wouldn't give me a raise at SPIE, and I was frustrated. So I figured out that it would be cheaper if I went home and started writing articles, and I started writing business articles for Business Pulse at that time, Business Pulse and a couple other magazines. And then I started in the network marketing world and started coaching and developing entrepreneurs to become business people around the nation and become a top trainer in that industry. And then eventually I developed a coaching and training program, became a corporate consultant, and started working with corporations that were like the Amazon Herb Company, which did business in the Amazon rainforest. And I doubled the volume of that company. Eventually became my own writer, teacher, and trainer, and then ran into Irene at a meeting one day and started on the last 9 years of my journey doing research on the mass incarceration industry and how it was destroying our communities, and what we could do locally to flip that industry upside down so that we could actually start reinvesting in our community instead of extracting money from the economy. How could we put it back in?
So tell me a little more about when you met Irene Morgan, the amazing Irene Morgan, also a good friend of mine.
Yeah, Irene and I go back many years, but I always knew her as sort of this this person who was always helping people that were on the wrong side of the tracks, if you will. And in those days, I was very ethnocentric, working with people around the nation, but people who are always interested in business and business development and human development and leadership. And at that point, I had just completed a movie called Flipping the Joy Switch, which is that's a commercial name for how to pull out of the good guy, bad guy, victim, or codependency triangle of habits of thinking and becoming a leadership thinker and a person who was a builder, leader, and innovator of change. So I was getting ready to market my film, and someone invited me to this reentry meeting, and I thought I was going to the reentry meeting to help business people who were having problems reentering society after the stock market crash and after so many people had lost homes or been harmed. And I ended up walking into a reentry meeting, and Irene was there, and I said, what in the world am I doing here if you're the founder of the coalition? And I said, what's the coalition? And she said, I'm helping people reenter after incarceration. And I went, I have no idea why I'm here, but I'm supposed to be here or I wouldn't be here, so what's up about that? And she told me it was how mass incarceration had become the economy that was actually driving poverty, and it was driving trauma, and it was driving mental illness, and it was driving it. We had created, basically, since I had left politics back in the 70s, we basically had created over the last 4 decades this mass incarceration industry that's gutting our communities today. And I made an agreement with her then to help her figure out how to do a grand turnaround on that, and we've been working on it ever since.
And you have really been working on it. So much research, so many things that you've accomplished. So why don't you just tell us, there's so many, but give us an idea of what you've accomplished with that.
Well, we've published, I guess the best way is just to talk about what have we published to educate the public about what is the impact of mass incarceration on our local community. We started out, because I didn't know anything about it, for 40 years. I had always just voted yes on every tax initiative. I'd voted yes on every campaign, everything that the prosecutor voted for and said we should do. I just automatically said yes. Everything the cops wanted, I said yes. And that's because back in the 70s, when I worked at campus security as a student patrol officer, my friend
Western.
Karen Mandick at Western, I was a student at Western back in the 70s, and I had become a student officer up there. I drove a patrol car and did all these things. And a friend of mine was engaged. It was the fiance for Karen Mandick, who was killed by the Hillside Strangler. And when the Hillside Strangler was captured by some of my police friends and then prosecuted and put away by the McEachran, Prosecutor McEachran back then, for the next 30, 40 years, I had just sort of written off incarceration as something that our cops were taking care of. And our prosecutors were, they did a good job. I just trusted them. I just signed yes. And in 2010, when I met Irene at that meeting, I realized that why in the world are we building a 2,400 bed facility in Whatcom County that's gonna cost us $100 million? And why don't we have a solid needs assessment and good statistics to back it up if they're gonna ask me as a taxpayer to pay for it? As a businesswoman, I'm just going, we have a problem. And I started studying on that, and we hosted a conference called the Community Visionaries Conference so that I could do discovery in the community on what were the real social and civic problems, because I didn't know. From their standpoint, I knew from my world, but not theirs. And we had about 30 or 40 people come speak, and from it I developed an appreciating society model, which today has become the divest from prisons and incarceration and invest in people chart. So it's a model for how, when you invest in prisons and you invest in control and you invest in punishment for profit and you invest in guns and machines, you create a depreciating spiral, which has led to criminal justice being the basis of what's causing homelessness and poverty and just so much destruction, violence and guns and everything else. So I decided, how could I create a different version? And I literally inverted the system and said, okay, if we didn't have this industry growing, what would be growing instead? And so this is the green business economy. This is the red business economy. This one doesn't work. This one does work. How can we do it? So I developed a hypothesis and a model that I could start working with. Then I went in and I said, okay, how big is this industry? This one over here that is so destructive, what does that really look like? And I realized that I created this true cost of incarceration chart, and you can't see it very well. But the bottom line of it is I found out that on a national level, they figure the cost of incarceration is $80 billion. But when you look around and you look at what's the ripple effect of the incarceration, what happens to people who get incarcerated? They get divorced, they go suicidal, they lose their jobs. All of these things happen. And the Washington University in St. Louis did a report, and they came out and they said, just measuring the ripple effects of incarceration on our society, like what do we pay in health services and additional welfare costs, that's $1 trillion economy. So it's actually $1 trillion plus 80 billion. That's a huge economic drain. And then I did additional research and found out that every single person who gets arrested, it's going to cost them between $3,000 and $30,000, whether they're convicted or not, whether they go into the system or not. And that's a direct hit on a family. So when we start looking around at the homeless and we start looking around at people who are broken and wounded in the streets and dealing with mass poverty, a lot of it is triggered because the families are thrown into poverty from an arrest, any kind of an arrest. And that's disastrous. The ripple effect and the secondary and third ripple effects of this it's just a devastating economy. So that's formed the basis of the next venture. And the next venture was when I realized that in Whatcom County, they were trying to pass $120 million sales tax on to the taxpayers. And I went, we can't afford it. The middle class is already broke. You know, we've already gone downhill. The small businesses are already broken. So what is the replacement economy if I use this chart and if I use this knowledge? So now I've got a basis upon which to write, which became the Stop Punishing Taxpayers, Start Rebuilding Community vision for Whatcom County. So if we didn't build this huge jail out in the county, what would we build? And what could we do? And where could the community get involved in it? And that led to this report, which actually led to the failure, helped educate the people so that they could imagine not voting for the jail tax, and they could imagine building, you know, wet houses and community projects and sustainable farms and all these other things. So that's the next project.
And that was terrific. I'm so glad you did that.
It was huge because it allowed other people in the community to imagine that we could do something other than build a jail. And that was, to me, profound, because one of my models is there's no point in telling people what you can't do. Just tell me what you can do. I actually learned that from a 4-H leader when I was a kid in Washington, D.C. I'd gone down back for the Washington State, or the citizenship conference, anyway, done National Citizenship Conference. I was like in 8th grade. And there was this little old lady walked into a conference room, and she walked in to do this seminar for a bunch of us kids. And she came in and she said, don't tell me what you won't do, tell me what you will do. Don't tell me what you won't do, tell me what you will do. Don't tell me what you won't do, tell me what you will do. And she was a top broker in the real estate industry, and she said, it never helps me to solve a problem if people tell me what they won't do. Only tell me what you will do, and then if you'll do this piece and somebody else will do this piece and somebody else, together we can make something happen.
All right.
And I never forgot that, because she was just this little old feisty gal, a lot like you, actually, and a lot like Irene. You're little people, but boy, do you pack a wallop, and that's important, feisty.
We're feisty. And that reminds me of the Homes Now, Not Later Bellingham model.
Yep.
Because that's similar to exactly pretty much to what they are doing.
Yep, and they just keep on trucking, and they're a small nonprofit that is not heavily funded. That's one of the things that Irene found, is that a lot of the innovative nonprofits are not funded by anybody. And we have to work really hard to get funded if we're not part of the establishment troops. So over the last 9 years, Irene and I and a lot of our members in the coalition have had to work and do things without a lot of financial support and without anything. So when I came up, then there were a couple other projects. Should I keep going?
Let's go on. I want to find out what you plan to do as sheriff.
As sheriff. Now that's an interesting conversation because I never intended to be sheriff when I started. But what I found over the last 9 years of trying to lobby against the jail building plan and to lobby for restorative justice and to lobby for mental health recovery and to lobby, not lobby, but to advocate for positive change and health and innovation, I found myself in every single incarceration prevention and reduction task force, and I found myself in every meeting being obstructed by the establishment thinking around jails and justice. And I found myself historically, every single time we were trying to bring something forward, either the prosecutor shot it down, or the executive was shooting it down, or the sheriff. And invariably, when I looked back at it about a year ago, I went, you know what? At every single turn, we get obstructed by the sheriff's statistics, which are not verifiable, or the sheriff's opinions, or somebody inside the institution is telling us, no, we can't do that. And I finally, this year, I did a jail trauma interviews with a bunch of people inside the jail and justice system to figure out what is it that needed to be done. If it could be done, still, I wasn't thinking I was going to be running for sheriff. But by the time I was done interviewing 79 people in Whatcom County, and I realized that no one of these people, whether they were the people who had called 911 to get help for their family member, nor the person who went into the jail system, expected to get arrested when they called 911 or when they were dealing with 911. And I went, what's up with that? And I realized that since 9/11, our world has changed dramatically. And most of us from decades ago grew up thinking that if you called for help, you actually got help. And so we say things and we do things in a 911 call, which is all pre-arrest, okay, that cause the family to end up in these situations where family members get arrested, families get investigated, these incredible costs mount, and it's very expensive. And so I started to add up how much it costs families, and it's easily $3,000 to $30,000 that it can cost a family when any event happens, an incident. And this is unwitting costs. Most of us, the judges don't know about this money. The police don't know about this money. The cop, nobody knows because we're all siloed up. And so a few months ago, I said, we got to find a new sheriff. We had a new prosecutor, and we need to find a new sheriff. And I started talking to policemen that I knew and asking them who could run for sheriff. I even posted on Facebook looking for somebody to run for sheriff. And no one. I said, I'd love to support somebody who's running for sheriff because we need someone who's actually eager to help us implement change, not one who's constantly pulling us back. The current incumbent sheriff, what he's done is he's passed a couple sales taxes since he was brought here in 2000 and when he was first nominated and then appointed to the position in 2003. He's passed 2 jail taxes, he's built a jail, and then he's tried to push these 2 huge jails on us. And he won't take no for an answer, and the voters have said no. People have testified no. We've all testified that we want restorative justice and alternatives to building a jail, and he keeps refusing. So at one point, one of the people I was talking to who was a law enforcement officer, he said, Joy, he says, why don't you run for sheriff? And I said, I wouldn't want to do that. And he said, yes, you can. And I said, doesn't he have to be law enforcement? And they said, no, you have to be a good manager. The sheriff is the policymaker. He's the manager of the department. And that's 207 staff or so. The whole goal is management of the force And I realized that the jail is truly messed up. But we can reduce the occupancy load by moving the sheriff's office out. We can into a different facility, and we can actually improve the conditions for the sheriffs to work at a more efficient location, which is over at the emergency management facility or a building across the street. They don't need a jail to live in order for them to do the best work. In fact, it's contraindicated. The second thing is we can just clean the jail as it is right now, clean it and paint it and make it more livable and more humane just by maintaining it differently. A good comparison to that is when you go over to the juvenile jail and you look at how that is decorated. Very, very different. And then third, separate maximum security inmate holds, people who are really dangerous. They need to be in a maximum security facility. But all nonviolent and lower level, low risk people should not be mixed in with that population. They should be held over at jail number 2 in the work release facility. We've got 150 beds that are not fully occupied, and they're using them for work release. What are we doing that for? I mean, it's great that we're doing it. I'm not opposed to that. But we can be working low level, low risk people through that facility. We can be implementing all kinds of preventive, community prevention programs, mental health programs, substance abuse programs. There's a huge gap in Whatcom County to provide that helps people get out of the system before they even go in. And that's my goal as a new sheriff. And so I will absolutely be looking at how do we prevent jailing? How do we cut 50% of the load out of the jail system? And we can do it. Federally, they're trying to do it. They have whole Cut 50 programs. We can do that even better here because we're not dealing with felons all the time. Most of the people going into the justice system are misdemeanors, and they're people who are not yet convicted, and people who go in there are often not traumatized beforehand. Why are we making them worse? It's ridiculous. We can turn it around and do something completely different. So yes, I'm running for sheriff. I'd love to thank you for interviewing me. There's a lot we can do when you want to, and the community can come up with a lot of things. It's far better if we put people back to work after a crisis rather than lock them up and make them worse. We can do it different.
Wow, thank you, Joy.
Thank you, Lynnette.
I know you can do it.
I'm planning on it.
You've proved it.
Yeah, it's
So,
been a while.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, we've shut 2 jail taxes down, and the public is getting educated. Homes Now is doing amazing things. The Incarceration Prevention Reduction Task Force is doing amazing things. It's really awesome. They're working on the justice system from the inside out. Now it's time for the community to start working from the outside in, and together with a sheriff that wants to make it different, aggressively wants to make it different, we can do it. And we do not need more taxes. We do not need another jail. If anything, we need more development out at the work release facility to put people back to work. We need investment in people, not facilities.
Right.
So thank you.
And as far as the money situation, it's going to be a much better use of taxpayer dollars.
It's the internal rate of return on investing in people is so much better than the internal rate of return on facilities. You know, when you're investing in hard real estate and you're investing in maximum security facilities and putting minimum security people in it, it's completely contraindicated. It is not healthy for our community to do that. That's been proven.
Okay.
So, thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for